It's splitting again. An engineer stepped forward, visor fogged with sweat, gripping a glowing rod of metal the color of a dying sun. Under its own weight, the metal tore apart in his hands. Another failure, identical to the last dozen, and the dozen before that. In these early hours of the 1,940 seconds, with the world collapsing into the Second World War, British metallurgists had already delivered their verdict. No air-cooled piston engine with more than 18 cylinders would ever survive its own heat. The stresses would rip it apart. The combustion would eat it alive from the inside. And they had reason to believe it. The finest American bomber then flying, the B-29 Flying Fortress, ran on 4 Wright Cyclone engines, producing about 1,200 horsepower each. Impressive, but nowhere near enough. Over the Pacific, the distances were too vast, the ocean too wide, the stakes too high. Striking Tokyo required a machine far stronger than anything airborne. Inside this forge, the men knew what the textbooks said. They knew the British warnings. No crankcase could survive the torque. The cylinders would overheat. The geometry itself was doomed. But they had been told something far heavier. That without an engine powerful enough to push a fully loaded bomber across thousands of miles of ocean, thousands of American air crews would die before ever reaching Japan. So they worked. Molten aluminum flowed like liquid light into molds, meant to become the heart of a bomber not yet built. Every casting cracked. Every cylinder warped. Heat blamed design. Design blamed metallurgy. Yet with each failure, they inched closer to understanding something strange, that under enough stress, metal behaves like a living organism. It twists, expands, screams, and if shaped correctly, it can learn to endure. By dawn, the forge quieted. Men stood around a cooling crankcase, unsure whether it would hold. Their supervisor, Frederick Brackett, wiped soot from his face and murmured, "If it doesn't break, we're one step closer. If it does, we forge it again." The deeper the war pushed into the 1,940 seconds, the clearer one truth became inside the Pentagon. The United States was fighting a conflict measured not just in battles, but in miles, vast, merciless miles. The Pacific was not a battlefield. It was an oceanic continent, a stretch of water so wide that even America's best bombers strained simply to cross it. Every new island gained, every airfield carved out of coral and jungle, brought the war a little closer to Japan, but never close enough. Logistics officers ran the numbers. Pilots argued the physics. Generals pored over maps where distances were marked, not in inches, but in lifetimes. The conclusion was always the same. No aircraft, then in service, could strike the Japanese home islands from existing bases and return alive. Behind closed doors in Washington, the pressure reached a breaking point. General Henry, Hap Arnold, commander of the Army Air Forces, was known for his calm resolve. But during one particularly tense meeting, he pounded the table hard enough to rattle coffee cups. "If we can't hit Tokyo," he said, "we can't end this war." For the engineers listening, that wasn't strategy, it was a deadline. What the military demanded next bordered on the absurd. A bomber twice the size of the B-17, fast enough to outrun interceptors, high-flying enough to evade ground fire, and capable of hauling a payload across 5,000 miles of ocean. It would be christened the B-29 Superfortress, and its design pushed the boundaries of aviation so far that even its blueprints felt ambitious, almost arrogant. But the aircraft itself wasn't the impossible part. Its engines were. The Air Staff's specifications called for something engineers had never attempted. A piston engine capable of delivering more than 3,500 horsepower continuously at altitudes where oxygen thinned, temperatures plunged, and materials behaved unpredictably. The weight limit was unforgiving, less than 3,500 pounds. Every pound above that risked reducing range, reducing payload, or costing lives. Aerodynamicists warned that power at that magnitude would generate destructive torsion. Metallurgists predicted catastrophic heat buildup. Even optimistic designers admitted that existing engines would be torn apart by forces they were never meant to withstand. Across the Atlantic, Rolls-Royce sent a cautionary cable to their American counterparts. Their analysis was blunt. A 28-cylinder radial arranged in 4 rows would create vibration patterns that could self-destruct the engine from the inside out. Torque pulses, harmonic resonance, thermal expansion, every variable seemed determined to sabotage the idea before it left the drafting table. Yet the United States had no alternative. Without an engine that exceeded every known limit, the B-29 would remain a dream on paper. In factories and universities across the country, teams were assembled: mechanical engineers, chemists, aerodynamicists, machinists, barely out of apprenticeship. Their challenge wasn't refinement, it was reinvention. They weren't asked to improve on existing designs. They were told to leap beyond them. Pratt and Whitney stepped forward with a proposal that felt almost reckless. A 4-row radial with 7 cylinders per row. A spiraling configuration that promised immense power if it could survive its own violence. They named it the R-4360 Wasp Major, a title that hinted at both ambition and danger. Blueprints alone made seasoned engineers uneasy. Barrels of aluminum alloy would need to endure pressures that approached the limits of physics. Pistons would operate at temperatures brushing against the melting point of their own materials. The crankshaft, the engine's spine, would absorb forces that could twist steel like rope. Still, the alternative was unthinkable. The B-29 program was approved. Funding flooded in. Factories retooled overnight. The Superfortress was already under construction before a single functioning Wasp Major existed. The United States was betting a war, and thousands of lives, on an engine that lived only as sketches and calculations. The race wasn't just against Japan. It was against time itself. When the first full-scale Wasp Major finally took shape, towering on its mounts like a metal creature waiting to wake, the men who built it understood something clearly. Every bolt tightened, every fuel line connected, every safety glass polished, was a step closer to a moment none of them fully trusted. On the morning of its inaugural test in December 1942, the concrete test cell in East Hartford felt less like a workshop and more like a bunker preparing for a contained detonation. Technicians checked gauges with trembling fingers. The engine block, an enormous spiraled structure of 28 cylinders, rested bolted to the floor like a chained animal. Fuel lines slithered across the concrete. Clipboards shook in unsteady hands. Even the veterans who had worked with high-power radials for years found themselves swallowing hard, eyeing the reinforced walls. When the starter motor whined to life, no one breathed. The engine coughed once. Then the Wasp Major roared awake. Blue flames leapt from its exhaust stacks, painting the ceiling with frantic light. For 6 seconds, the sound was triumph, a thunderous heartbeat echoing inside a concrete cave. Then came a metallic shriek, a vibration spike, and a blast so violent it shattered 2 windows in the control room. Shrapnel rained down. The test cell doors buckled outward. One engineer, stunned, muttered, "It's fighting itself." He was right. The creature they had summoned was devouring its own body. Post-explosion analysis revealed the nightmare. Each row of cylinders was heating and expanding at slightly different rates. The perfectly machined crankshaft was being twisted by invisible hands, microscopic warping that compounded with every revolution. No one had ever seen frequencies like this. They weren't just dealing with heat or pressure. They were dealing with chaos. Pratt and Whitney immediately convened what amounted to an emergency scientific congress. Stress testing equipment arrived from MIT. Chemical analysts were dispatched from Yale. Bell Labs sent vibration specialists to examine frequency signatures that looked like seismic activity. Across a dozen drafting tables, equations sprawled like musical scores, calculations of torque pulses, oscillation harmonics, wave interference, thermal expansion coefficients. The more they solved, the more variables appeared. It was a mechanical hydra. Fix one failure mode, another emerged somewhere else. Meanwhile, outside the test cell, impatience grew. The Army Air Forces needed engines. B-29 airframes were already rolling out of factories. Bombers without engines were nothing but metal shells, expensive, useless, and terrifying reminders that time was slipping away. One morning, a colonel from right field arrived unannounced. He walked into the engineering room with the stiffness of a man carrying both authority and blame. "General Arnold wants a status update," he said. "When can he expect a working engine?" The lead engineer didn't look up from his notes. "When we figure out how to stop physics," he answered. The colonel didn't laugh. The war was not a place for jokes. Prototype after prototype followed. The second engine ran for 14 minutes before seizing solid. The third lasted 42 minutes before a valve head snapped off and shattered a piston. The fourth ran longer but fractured under thermal stress, splintering aluminum across the floor. Every failure meant hundreds of hours rebuilding what felt like a doomed machine. Mechanics worked under floodlights through the night, still slick with sweat and aviation fuel hours after their shifts should have ended. The hallways began to smell permanently of scorched aluminum, a scent that clung to clothing, hair, even their thoughts. One technician said later, "It felt like listening to a giant hold its breath before it screamed." But they weren't alone in the struggle. Across the country, Wright Aeronautical was fighting the same physics in their duplex cyclone. Allison's liquid-cooled monster kept boiling itself alive. Even the mighty British Merlin, famous for the Spitfire, barely produced half the power the B-29 required and demanded constant maintenance. The Americans weren't seeking excellence. They were seeking endurance. If existing alloys couldn't survive the heat, Pratt and Whitney decided, then the alloys themselves had to change. This decision shifted the project from engineering into alchemy. New furnaces were constructed taller, hotter, more ferocious than any used before for aircraft engines. Metallurgists began experimenting with nickel-chromium superalloys. Some samples exploded under the hammer, sending shards skittering across the floor. Others warped into unusable shapes, like metal trying to escape its own identity. Still, patterns emerged. A balance of nickel, copper, and aluminum showed signs of surviving temperatures near 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit without losing strength. Cooling, however, remained the persistent demon. Outer cylinders basked in the oncoming air. Inner cylinders baked alive. Sketches of cooling schemes filled napkins, clipboard margins, and the backs of cafeteria receipts. Ducts, vanes, forced air manifolds, blower assemblies, most ideas died by morning. Then came a proposal from a young designer, barely into his 20s. A gear-driven fan mounted directly behind the propeller. Brutal, inefficient, but brilliant. It forced air where none wanted to go straight into the engine's overheated core. With it, the next test finally lasted an hour, then 2, then 5. Success, though, came with danger. In one test, a seized bearing hurled a connecting rod through the engine casing. Shrapnel punched into the control booth. From that day on, technicians wore steel helmets. They joked that if the engine ever flew, it would be to escape its own test cell. But beneath the jokes was something real. The sense that the machine was alive, tormented, and learning. The beast was still eating itself. But now, for the first time, it was losing the appetite. By the winter of 1943, the Pratt and Whitney plant in East Hartford no longer resembled a factory. It had transformed into something closer to a siege. The windows glowed orange through the night as if a firestorm raged behind the brick walls. Inside, men and women drifted in quiet, exhausted currents between machine shops, foundries, and test cells. Their faces were smudged with graphite, their hands marked by burns that never fully healed. Sleep became optional. Coffee became survival. And the war became personal. At the center of this restless world stood a man who seemed carved from the same steel he worked with, Frederick Brackett, 53 years old, a metallurgist long before the word held prestige. His hair thinned, his voice softened, but his will hardened as the project grew more brutal. His office was a chaos of sketches, failed cylinder fragments, chemical charts, and coffee rings layered like tree bark. To younger engineers, Brackett was both myth and mentor. He had a habit of running his fingers along cracked components as if listening for secrets. When frustration peaked, He'd offer the same quiet reminder. The metal is telling us something. We just need to learn its language. Learning that language cost them sleep, skin, and sanity. Brackett barely returned home anymore. He slept on a narrow cot behind the forge, rising whenever the test alarms wailed through the building. Letters from his wife piled unopened in a drawer. Weeks later, he'd sift through them by the dim glow of a drafting lamp, reading words of worry written in neat cursive. "You sound tired," she wrote once. "Remember that engines can wait. You can't." He folded the letter, slipped it into his coat pocket, and walked back into the inferno of the shop floor. Engines, he believed, couldn't wait. Not when men were dying in the Pacific faster than factories could build machines to protect them. One evening, a young mechanic named Samuel Ortiz, just 22, approached Brackett. Ortiz had joined the factory after his older brother was killed flying a B-24 over the Pacific. He had a machinist's steady hands and the quiet dread of someone carrying fresh grief. "Sir," Ortiz asked softly, polishing a valve cover until it shone like a mirror, "if this engine works, does that mean fewer boys die out there?" Brackett hesitated, the truth heavy on his tongue. "If it works," he said, "their chances improve." "But engines don't end wars, Sam. People do." Ortiz nodded, then went back to polishing, each stroke slower, more deliberate. These workers weren't soldiers, yet they lived in a kind of combat rhythm. The welders who carried burn scars like medals. The women in assembly lines who tightened bolts with blistered hands. The test crews who risked their lives every time they hit the starter switch. They knew the front lines began in that factory, beneath the glow of molten metal. In February, another prototype exploded. Shrapnel tore through the control booth with enough force to embed itself into steel support beams. Technician Robert Kane lost 2 fingers shielding a coworker from flying debris. He refused to leave the hospital until Brackett visited and signed his cast with a pencil. "It held longer this time," Kane whispered, managing a crooked smile. Every test was a mix of theater and terror. Engineers watched from behind thick glass as the Wasp Major wound itself into a fury. They learned to read the engine by sound. A smooth growl meant hope. A rising pitch meant panic. And when the pitch crossed a certain threshold, when it sharpened into something unnatural, everyone instinctively braced. Then came the bang. Always the bang. Silence followed, punctuated only by the soft clicks of cooling metal settling into defeat. Outside the test cell doors, life shrank into a rhythm of hours and alarms. Workers ate standing up. Loudspeakers blasted news from Europe and the Pacific, Anzio, Monte Cassino, Leyte Gulf, while pistons were fitted, crankcases hammered, and shaft tolerances checked to the width of a human hair. Some had husbands, brothers, or sons flying behind earlier Pratt and Whitney engines. Every fraction of vibration corrected, every ounce of heat managed, meant another bomber might return home instead of vanishing into the ocean. Brackett rarely spoke about the weight of responsibility he carried, but it lived in the slump of his shoulders, the way he lingered beside a running test, as if listening not just to the machine, but to the echoes of those it might save. One night, an assistant found him alone, staring at a cracked cylinder head illuminated by a single desk lamp. "It's a miracle, you know," Brackett murmured. "Metal shouldn't survive what we're putting it through. None of this should work. And yet, somehow it does." He paused, then added quietly, "Maybe we're learning more about ourselves than the engine." By spring, they reached their closest breakthrough yet. The Model D prototype completed a 14-hour run without failure. The factory erupted not with cheers, but with exhausted relief. Someone unearthed a radio, and Glenn Miller's swing music floated through the plant. For a moment, the war felt distant, like a memory instead of a shadow. But the next morning, during inspection, a cooling fin lay snapped on the floor. The test was over. No one spoke for a long time. A week later, a letter arrived from a B-29 crew chief stationed on Guam. "We hear you're building something big. Whatever it is, hurry. These engines burn oil faster than we can replace it." Brackett pinned the letter to the bulletin board. After that day, no one complained about overtime. The plant never truly slept again. Sparks fell like rain in the foundry. Rivet guns clicked in steady rhythm. And somewhere in a small office, Brackett drafted the formula for a new alloy, one that could stretch without cracking and endure temperatures that had destroyed everything before it. He named it 75 Eniku. To the workers, it earned a simpler name, the Survivor. When the team finally tore down the Wasp Major after its first long, stable run, what they discovered inside was equal parts terrifying and astonishing. Under magnifying lamps, engineers examined pistons that had endured temperatures approaching 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. Bearings showed smooth, uniform wear, something no one had dared hope for. And the crankcase, the immense forged heart of aluminum and nickel, maintained its geometry with near-surgical precision. For the first time, the impossible seemed possible. But proving the engine could survive was only the first step. The next challenge was far more daunting, turning this unpredictable monster into a mass-produced machine of war. To understand what they were building, one had to look at the engine not as an assembly of parts, but as an architecture. The R-4360 didn't resemble a typical radial engine, it resembled a metallic cathedral. Its layout spiraled in 4 concentric rows, 7 cylinders per row, 28 in total, wrapped around a central crankshaft thicker than a man's torso. Each cylinder fired in a carefully timed dance that produced more thunder than combustion. At full throttle, this cathedral inhaled roughly 2,000 cubic feet of air every minute and swallowed fuel faster than a truck could pump it. 16 magnetos governed the rhythm of 56 spark plugs. More than 140 precisely engineered oil lines fed lubricant to every point where failure might begin. And every component from piston rings to connecting rods had to be redesigned to tolerate stresses no aircraft engine had ever endured. Cooling, however, remained the last great unsolved mystery. Temperature readings painted a grim picture. Outer cylinders hovered around 375 degrees Fahrenheit. Inner cylinders climbed toward 575 dangerous, engine-killing territory. If the temperature difference persisted, the engine would seize, fail, or tear itself apart mid-flight. It was Harold Wentworth, a young draftsman barely out of university, who proposed a solution so unconventional that senior engineers stared at him in silence. He suggested installing a gear-driven impeller fan directly behind the propeller hub, something that would shove massive amounts of air through a network of ducts reaching each cylinder row. It was inelegant. It would increase drag. And it might just work. When the design was built and tested in July 1944, the results stunned everyone. For the first time, every cylinder operated within 15 degrees of its neighbors. The engine ran 20 hours straight, no cracks, no seizures, no loss of power. Vibration charts flattened into clean, confident lines. One technician watched the oscilloscope trace a perfect rhythm and whispered, "It's singing." The next breakthrough attacked another ancient limitation: breathing at altitude. Most engines gasped thin air above 20,000 feet, their power dropping sharply. The Wasp Major needed to maintain sea-level strength even above 30,000. Pratt and Whitney built a 3-stage turbo-supercharging system, part mechanical compressor, part exhaust-driven turbine that pushed dense, oxygen-rich air into the cylinders. The system was so complex it needed its own oil cooling, its own pressure regulation, and its own testing regimen. With the new intercoolers, the Wasp Major could deliver full power high above the clouds, where other engines struggled just to stay running. But power created a new bottleneck: the propeller. Conventional blades twisted under torque and risked breaking apart at high RPM. Hamilton Standard's engineers responded with a 13-foot, 4-bladed propeller with massive paddle-shaped tips, each blade weighing over 100 pounds. At full speed, the blade tips approached the speed of sound, slicing the air with an intensity that made ground crews flinch even at idle. Pilots later compared takeoff to sitting inside a tornado made of steel. With core systems finally stable, production loomed. Factories needed to turn this cathedral into thousands of identical engines, each one reliable enough to carry bombers into war. East Hartford expanded by 40%. Entire new foundries were built specifically to forge crankshafts weighing nearly 600 pounds apiece. Hydraulic presses capable of exerting 1,000 200 tons of force, hammered glowing metal blanks into shape. Their foundations had to be poured 30 feet deep just to survive the shock. Inside machine shops, lathes sculpted these enormous pieces to tolerances measured in 10,000ths of an inch, slimmer than a sheet of paper, split into strips. X-ray inspection stations, using technology first developed for atomic research, scanned each crankshaft for invisible cracks. Assembly lines developed their own choreography. Blocks advanced station by station, first bare frameworks, then growing organs, pistons, rods, magnetos, superchargers. Women in red bandanas tightened fasteners with torque wrenches. Inspectors checked serial numbers like priests reciting liturgy. A completed Wasp major contained more than 7,000 individual parts. Fully assembled, it weighed around 3,400 pounds, nearly 2 tons of precision engineering. By late 1944, Pratt Whitney could produce 10 of them every day. Each engine was mounted onto a test stand for a 4-hour acceptance run, the roar echoing for miles. Local farmers complained the sound frightened their livestock. The engineers just smiled. To them, the noise was proof that the impossible was becoming real. Meanwhile, in Seattle, the B-29 Superfortress waited its enormous wings designed around the Wasp major, its future hanging on the success of the engine being forged in Connecticut. Billions of dollars had already been poured into the bomber program, more than the Manhattan Project itself. Now, all that ambition, all that metal, all that strategy depended on a cathedral of fire and steel finally learning to fly. By September 1944, the B-29 Superfortress sat waiting on airfields like a colossal promise. Engineers could walk beneath its wings without stooping. Its fuselage stretched longer than some town streets. Every surface of the aircraft carried the weight of expectation. Billions of dollars had been poured into its creation. Factories across the nation had retooled to build it. Lives, strategy, and the course of the Pacific War were now tied to whether its engines, 4R, 4,360 Wasp majors, could truly perform. On the morning of September 21st, Boeing Field in Seattle hummed with a kind of cautious electricity. Lieutenant Frank Reynolds, the crew chief, walked slowly under each nacelle, running his fingers along the cooling fins. The engines glinted under the sun, their polished metal surfaces catching the light like armor. Inside the cockpit, famed test pilot Eddie Allen settled into the left seat, calm, precise, a man whose pulse didn't rise even when flying something no one fully trusted yet. He flipped the first ignition switch. The engine coughed, shook once, then found its voice a deep, rolling thunder that vibrated through the concrete. The second came online, then the third, then the fourth. The sound joined into a single, overwhelming presence, a layered harmony so powerful the ground crew felt it in their teeth. Allen released the brakes. The B-29 began to roll, gaining speed faster than anyone expected. Air rushed beneath the wings. And then, almost casually, the impossible happened. 70,000+ pounds of aluminum, fuel, engines, and ambition lifted into the sky. Cheers erupted on the ground, but most were swallowed by the engine's roar. At 100 feet, Reynolds checked the gauges from the flight engineer's station. Oil pressure held steady. Cylinder head temperatures hovered comfortably inside range. Fuel flow remained smooth. Over the intercom, Allen said only, "She flies smooth. Feels lighter than she should." The aircraft banked over Seattle, circling gracefully for 30 minutes. No misfires, no surges, no vibration spikes, no smoke curling where it shouldn't. When the B-29 touched down again and rolled to a stop, the field fell strangely quiet. The engines ticked as they cooled, a soft metallic heartbeat easing into silence. No one spoke at first. They simply stared. In the hours that followed, technical reports read more like reverent tributes than engineering logs. Power output stable at 3,500 horsepower continuous. Vibration negligible. Cylinder performance uniform. Endurance projected beyond 400 hours. This last figure astonished observers. Most wartime combat engines needed overhauls after 90 or 100 hours. The Wasp Major wasn't just meeting expectations, it was rewriting them. Yet what cemented its legacy wasn't its performance on a single prototype. It was the reality that this was only one of thousands soon to come. The Wasp Major wasn't a hand-built masterpiece crafted by a small team of experts. It was a product of America's industrial machine, designed to be forged, machined, assembled, tested, crated, shipped, installed, and flown at a scale never before attempted. Pratt Whitney handled the core manufacturing. Ford and General Motors produced major components. Satellite plants across the country built cooling fans, accessory drives, and crankcases. By 1945, the nationwide network of factories was producing enough Wasp Majors each month to power an entire fleet of Superfortress bombers. Behind every engine was a human story. A machinist in Ohio polishing his 1,000th piston. A woman in Kansas City stamping inspection numbers on spark plugs. A crew of welders in Connecticut finishing a crankcase that would soon cross the Pacific on a bomber they would never see. Most would never know which engine they built, but every one of them left fingerprints on history. In its refined wartime configuration, the R-4360 produced upward of 4,300 horsepower, roughly double the output of the British Merlin, triple that of Germany's best radials. It could haul bombers and transport aircraft heavier than anything that had ever taken flight. Pilots later described the sensation of takeoff as being pushed by a hurricane. The engine had been born in explosions, rebuilt through sleepless months, hammered into existence by a country racing against time. Now it was airborne. Now it worked. Now it lived. And soon, the world would learn what happened when this mechanical heart, once declared impossible, became the muscle behind America's most ambitious bomber. By early 1945, the Wasp Major had moved far beyond the test stands of Connecticut. Now it pulsed inside silver wings over the largest ocean on Earth. On March 9th of that year, before dawn had fully lifted, the scale of its purpose came into view. Off the coast of Japan, 40 miles from the shoreline, a formation unlike anything the world had ever seen took shape. 400 B-29 Superfortresses stretched across the horizon in a shimmering, metallic line. Beneath each wing, 4 R-4000, 360 engines beat in unison. The sound rolled together not as individual propellers, but as a single mechanical thunder that seemed to vibrate the sea itself. Pilots later said the noise felt alive, more like a geological force than a machine. Below them, Tokyo slept under a thin veil of mist. For years, Japan had lived outside the reach of American bombers, protected by the brutal mathematics of distance. But the Wasp Major changed that equation. With each engine delivering over 3,500 horsepower, the B-29 could climb above most anti-aircraft fire, outrun many interceptors, and carry bomb loads across distances no earlier aircraft could enduringly manage. On that night, the bombers left from bases on Tinian Island, a flight of more than 500 miles each way. Crews sat in pressurized cabins, watching the glow of exhaust flames reflect off the ocean far below. Lieutenant Jack Simmons, a flight engineer aboard a Superfortress nicknamed Lucky 7, wrote in his diary, "I can feel the engines through the floor. It's not vibration anymore. It's a heartbeat. As long as it beats, we live." When the formation reached Tokyo, 279 aircraft pushed inward over the city. They released 1,665 tons of incendiary bombs, and within minutes, firestorms swept across entire districts. 16 square miles of the city were consumed. Over 100,000 lives were lost, and more than 1 million people were left homeless. It was the most destructive air raid in human history. Yet inside each aircraft, survival depended entirely upon the engines. The mission stretched 12 to 15 hours. If one engine failed, the bomber might limp home. If two failed, the crew was likely lost. Earlier, radial engines often overheated in the climb or starved for air in the thin altitudes over the Pacific. But the Wasp Major rarely faltered. Cylinder pressures held. Oil temperatures remained steady. The supercharger kept the airflow rich. Pilots said the engines felt as if they wanted to keep flying even after the bombers rolled to a stop on the runway. Each mission began with ritual. Ground crews lined beneath the wings, listening with practiced ears as magneto switches were flipped one by one. Engines coughed, belched smoke, and then locked into that deep, rolling thunder. Crews often cheered when all four settled into rhythm. It meant their friends had a fighting chance of coming home. The engine's reliability reshaped America's air strategy. Now raids could launch in waves, hundreds of planes at once, their engines synchronized into a single droning tide. Even elite Japanese aces, including the legendary Saburo Sakai, admitted defeat. "We could not reach them," he recalled. "They flew higher than our fighters, faster than our bullets." By June 1945, the war's geography collapsed. Cities once unreachable, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, burned under repeated raids. Engineers in Connecticut tracked reports obsessively, noting flight hours. Subai Bashitsi, Ubai Arshasant. The numbers defied belief. During entire squadron missions, the Wasp Major recorded 0 in-flight mechanical failures. With that reliability, the Pacific, a barrier for centuries, became a runway. And soon, it would carry more than bombs. It would carry the weapons that ended the war. When the war finally ended in August 1945, silence returned to East Hartford for the first time in 4 relentless years. The furnaces cooled, night shifts dissolved. The rhythmic thunder that had once shaken every street, the heartbeat of the Wasp Major, fell quiet. Workers who had lived in a world of fire and metal now walked out through the factory gates, carrying lunch pails instead of blueprints. For many, peace felt strangely hollow. Frederick Brackett lingered long after others left. His office still overflowed with sketches, metallurgical notes, and fragments of failed components he refused to discard. A cracked piston crown, one of the early casualties of the development years, sat on his windowsill like a monument to struggle. He kept it as a reminder that even the strongest materials could break, and that machines, like men, had limits. "Engines die too," he once said quietly to a visiting reporter. "You just hope they die after you no longer need them." The war was over, but the Wasp Major's service was not. The U.S. Army Air Forces reclassified it as a strategic engine for the post-war era. Soon it powered the massive B-50 bomber successor to the B-29, and later the enormous C-97 Stratofreighter transports that carried cargo and troops across continents. Airline passengers of the early 1,952nd sat by rounded windows of Boeing Stratocruisers, watching the giant propellers blur against the sky, unaware that the engines beneath them had been born in wartime desperation. Between 1,944 and 1,955, more than 1,800 Wasp Majors were built. They consumed enough aluminum to construct a small city, enough copper wiring to wrap around the globe twice. They became the mechanical spine of America's long-range aviation, reliable, powerful, unmistakable. But by the end of that decade, the world had already begun to move on. Jet propulsion, once fragile and experimental, matured with astonishing speed. A pair of General Electric J-47 turbojets could produce more thrust than 4R-4000, 360 seconds combined. The future didn't roar, it whistled. At first, old-school engineers resisted. They argued the piston giant could still be improved, refined, pushed further. Pratt & Whitney even built the upgraded R-436063 variant for the massive Convair B-36 Peacemaker, its wings carrying 6 Wasp Majors and 4 jet engines. For a brief, surreal moment, propellers and jets shared the skies together, like 2 eras shaking hands mid-flight. The handshake did not last long. By 1956, jet engines were no longer the future, they were the standard. Factories that once forged crankshafts now poured their talent into turbine blades. The great hammers went silent. In 1955, the final Wasp Major rolled off the assembly line. Technicians gathered around it for a photograph. 12 men in oil-stained uniforms beside a shining engine that looked more like a sculpture than machinery. Someone had written in chalk across the cowling, "She never quit." Brackett retired a year later. He carried that cracked piston home and placed it on a shelf in his garage, a relic of a battle fought not with guns, but with alloys and endurance. Letters still came from pilots who had flown behind the engines he helped create. "You brought us home," one wrote. "We trusted the sound." He never replied, but he kept every letter. The age of piston giants was fading, but their echoes, deep, resonant, unyielding, would never fully disappear. Today, only a handful of R4000 360 Wasp major engines still draw breath. They sit behind velvet ropes in quiet aviation halls. Dayton, Seattle, Pensacola. Colossal, polished, motionless. Children stare at them with wide eyes, unable to imagine that something so immense once fit inside an airplane wing. Tour guides recite numbers: 28 cylinders, 4,000, 300 horsepower, 7,000 parts. Visitors nod politely, unaware that behind those figures lay nights of fear, brilliance, and exhaustion. On certain weekends, museums bring one of the surviving engines to life. Mechanics gather around, tapping gauges, checking magnetos. The crowd leans in as the ignition sparks. The propeller hesitates, then begins to turn slow at first, then faster. Smoke billows from the stacks. A cough, a rumble, and suddenly the entire hangar vibrates. The first sound is not a roar. It is a pulse. Deep, rhythmic, ancient. People instinctively step back. The older ones close their eyes. Many of them remember fathers, uncles, or grandfathers who once built or flew behind that sound. The younger ones only stare half terrified, half mesmerized, as the floor shudders beneath their feet. For a moment, time folds. The engine becomes what it once was, a beating heart at the center of a world at war, forged by hands that refuse to surrender to equations or fear. Modern engineers studying it see more than a relic. They see the blueprint for what came next. The superalloys born in those furnaces became the foundation for jet turbines, rocket engines, even nuclear reactors. Cooling technologies pioneered for the Wasp major now exist inside air-cooled turbines around the globe. Its supercharging principles evolved into the compressors that power aircraft today. Piece by piece, the impossible machine transformed into the future. But its deepest legacy is not mechanical. It is human. Every bolt tightened by a tired mechanic. Every piston polished under fluorescent lights. Every failed test that sent shrapnel flying across a room. Every hour worked by people who believed their effort mattered, even if no one ever learned their names. Near the end of his life, Frederick Brackett's name was added to a small brass plaque at the New England Air Museum. Chief Metallurgist Pratt Whitney, R4000, 360 Wasp Major, 1,942, 1,945. No medals, no speeches, just a quiet acknowledgement of a man who taught metal to endure. Beneath that plaque, the engine stands silent, immense, unbroken. And if you listen closely, even in stillness, you can almost hear it. The echo of a heartbeat strong enough to carry a war, and a legacy strong enough to outlive one.